Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, Mr. Vice President. Welcome to join us today to discuss about the emerging giants, the BRIC countries, and the impact on the global policy making. This is the inaugural conference of Columbia University's BRIC Lab. To get our program started, I have the pleasure here to introduce the co-founders and directors of the BRIC Lab, beginning with Professor Christian Deseglise. Christian has been working in finance with emerging markets for the last 20 years. He's a managing director of HSBC Global Assets Management. More importantly, he has extraordinary vision on emerging market countries in terms of economic and policy impact and on the global economy and global policy making. He is the father of the first BRIC fund in the world, which was launched by HSBC in 2004. Please join me to welcome Christian.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Zoe. Zoe was also at HSBC. She's a portfolio manager in our emerging market fixed income capabilities, and she's also a brilliant student of Columbia University. She studied at SIPA a few years ago. We will have two MCs for today, one from China and one from Brazil, Vanessa Pereira. I think Vanessa should be in the audience there, so thank you very much for your participation. I would like really to thank several people before we start. A couple of students first that have been very helpful at putting together the event today. So Ivan Tona, I don't know if Ivan is here, but please stand up if you are here. He's in the back, so he's already standing up. And Pamela Kalakian also, who's been very helpful in putting the event together. I would also like to thank Columbia University, obviously, SIPA, represented here by Merit Janow. So thank you so much for the support. I think, and Merit, you will be talking about that, the BRIC Lab is very, very well suited for Columbia University and for SIPA in particular, so we will go over that in a second. I would also like to thank our sponsors, HSBC Global Banking and Markets, that has been helping us fund the event. And we have several representatives from HSBC here today. Silvia Coutinho, who is in charge of the bank in Latin America, and Deborah Hazel, who is also in charge of asset management for the Americas. So thank you so much for your support. The Forum das Américas, with the great presence of my friend Mario Garneiro of Brazil Invest, who has also been a great sponsor of the event. Marcos, actually my co-founder, is also very much involved with the initiative of Forum das Américas, and the Financial Times that has been helping us support the event. Thank you, John, for your help. We have had a couple of ads in the Financial Times, and I think you were kind enough to bring several of today's editions to the for the participant here. So thank you. Bloomberg, CNN will also be very active in the event. So you were saying I'm the father of the BRIC Fund. I feel I'm the grandfather. Like every day that is passing by, I feel I'm the grandfather of the BRIC story. But I did not invent the BRIC story. The BRIC story was invented by another investment bank. I'm not going to name the bank yet because they did not sponsor the event. So I'm not going to. Maybe next year, if they do sponsor the event, we'll mention the name. But BRIC actually has 10 years. Not today, a couple of days ago. So on November 30th, that was the 10th anniversary of the BRIC concept. And the BRIC concept has been a very successful one, and I think it's been very successful for a couple of reasons. One, the name is a pretty good one, right? BRIC, it flies very well. It's funny, you don't say fly like a brick, but it did fly pretty well. So I think the name was pretty catchy. But there is something beyond the name, and I think what is beyond the name is really the intuition that what Zoe was referring to as those emerging giants in 4 countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, that are really in a different league. They are much bigger than most other countries from a landmass point of view. In terms of population, together they represent approximately 40% of the world population. So you've got other countries which are very large, Indonesia, Pakistan, Nigeria, but those countries don't have the same type of, I would say, specific characteristics to become regional or even global players in the world. Mexico is a very significant country, but Mexico has chosen a path of development which links it to North America. Turkey is also a very significant country, but Turkey, same thing, has chosen a path of development which, at least for the time being, it may evolve, but for the time being, is linking it to Western Europe. So BRIC, I think, are really in a different league among the emerging countries. And I think part of the success of this BRIC concept was the intuition that those four countries together had the potential to outgrow the developed markets for a significant time and potentially to tip the balance of the center of gravity of the world economy towards the BRIC as opposed to the G7. And this had consequences not only from an economic point of view, but also from a political point of view. And it had really the potential to change the governance of the world economy, to move from G7 to G8, G9, and now G20. So I think that was really the success of the BRIC story. But it was a very bold intuition at the time, because if we go back in 2000, 10 years ago, China was a very fast-growing country, but it was a very small country. China was approximately the size of Italy, about $1 trillion economy. Brazil was just coming out of, or not even coming out, Brazil was still in economic crisis in 2000. It's only really after 2002 that Brazil starts taking off. Russia was just coming out of the debt default of 1998, and India was just only a few years into the liberalization and the opening of the economy. Russia in 2000 was an economy of $270 billion. That's it in total nominal GDP terms. So these economies were very, very small. All together, BRIC was half the size of Japan. That's it, half the size of Japan in 2000. So I think this kind of intuition that those countries together could have an impact on world affairs was a very bold one. Not a lot of people would have believed that, yes, the BRIC indeed could catch up and could become significant players in the world economy. Now, of course, throughout the noughties, the economies of the BRICs not only outgrew and outpaced the developed economy, but they went through the terrible crisis of 2008, 2009 pretty much unscathed. Russia did suffer, and Russia went through a very difficult recession, but Brazil, there was a period, a very, I would say, a limited period of time when growth hit a wall at the end of 2008 and early 2009, but because of the strength of Brazil, it rebounded very, very quickly. China went down to about 9%, so yes, it was, there was a period of slowdown, but not significant. And India barely noticed the crisis. So the four countries really, with the exception of Russia, went through the crisis pretty much unscathed. And now they're coming out of the crisis when the developed world is struggling with the consequences of very high indebtedness. Europe, I mean, you all know the issues in Europe, and I think Stephen King will be talking a little bit about that. So the world today looks very, very different from what it looked like in 2001. And today, the BRIC together represent approximately 18% of the world economy, almost the size of the US. The US is about 23% of the world economy. Back in 2000, the US was 33%. 1/3 of the world economy was the US. Now it's only 23%, and the BRICs are following like right behind in terms of economic size. The BRIC are twice the size of Japan when they were half the size of Japan 10 years ago. So I think the world has really changed, and you cannot open a newspaper today without reading about the BRIC. In fact, a couple of days ago, the New York Times had an article celebrating the 10-year anniversary of the BRIC, saying that, talking about the BRIC power and talking about whether the BRIC would be able to save Europe. So interesting to see how the tables really have turned, and now the BRICs, which were still in, I mean, for many of them 10 years ago, in a period of crisis, are now seen as the potential saviors of the world. But the BRIC is a difficult concept to define. Lots of uncertainties, as you know. What are the BRICs? I mean, should we be talking about 4 countries, 5 countries, BRIC with an S at the end, including South Africa, BRIC with a K, including Korea, BRICed with a T, including Turkey, BRIC or BRICy with Indonesia. So lots of uncertainties as to what the shape of the BRIC concept is. And also the BRICs really have not been coordinating policies, really. They've been thrown onto the world stage because of what has been going on in the world, but without really thinking about, common policies. So they meet from time to time. There is meetings of finance ministers. There are meetings of specific ministers also, summits also, where they invite usually South Africa. But it's still very, very much embryonic. There are very little structure around the BRICs. And the BRICs are very different countries too. And difficult to compare, Russia with India or Brazil with China. Very different types of systems, of macroeconomic structure. The structures of the economies also are extremely different in terms of access to natural resources or no access to natural resources. Political systems are extremely different. So the concept of BRIC is a little bit difficult to define, but the intuition that those countries are in a different league and have the potential to be a transforming event in the world economy remains there. Their impact on the environment, the impact on commodity, the access and the availability of natural resources. All this is likely, the rise of BRIC is likely to have a very, very important, or to shape very importantly, the way the world is going to unfold in the next 10 to 20 years. So this is what we will be talking about today. We'll have 2 panels that will look at the BRICs. What are the BRICs? The first one, chaired by James Crombie, and the second one, which will be moderated by Luis Vélez, about the geopolitical implications of BRIC and of the rise of BRIC. And then the last one will be focused on the first countries within the BRIC, so the B, Brazil. The Vice President of Brazil is here. The Governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro is here. So we will have a special, Brazil will be under the limelight of the BRIC Lab. Then as the BRIC Lab evolves, we will have one on Russia, one on India and China, and we will make this a periodic event. And we really want to use Colombia and SIPA as a forum where each of the BRICs can come, can meet, can discuss with policymakers of the developed markets and really help the shaping, I would say, of this new world order, this new world governance that we are about to see coming up now with the rise of BRIC. And I really think that Colombia and the BRIC Lab and SIPA, under the leadership of John Coatsworth, can really help shape this new identity. So thank you very much. I think I'll pass to my friend Marcos now.
So we will now hear from Professor Marcos Toyo, co-founder and director of BRIC Lab. Marcos is the founder of the Center for Business Diplomacy, an independent think tank on global entrepreneurship. He worked as a career diplomat at the Brazilian mission to the United Nations in New York and chief of the staff of Science and Technology Department of Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Welcome, Marcos.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Mr. Vice President, Professor Janow, I salute everyone. And it's a great honor for me, of course, to be, along with my friend Christian Deseglise, co-inaugurating the BRIC Lab with this conference today. And I think if the 500 people gathered here this morning would be able to take a shortcut into the future and board a time machine all the way to 2061, the next 50 years, we would be able to look back into this half century and come to realize that the past 50 years would have been decided by 4 questions. What the BRIC countries want for themselves and their populations, what BRIC countries want for their elites, what BRIC countries want from the world, and what BRIC countries want for the world. So the BRIC Lab will concentrate on examining the project of power, the project of prosperity, and the project of prestige of each of these 4 great nations that, as has been said on so many occasions, are really shaping this world to come. Through conferences, courses at Columbia universities, executive education programs, BRIC Lab, through the leadership of Christian and that of John Coatsworth, with the vision of setting up this really pioneering infrastructure in one of the world's premier universities, I think we're going to end up making a small contribution not only to the definition of the concept, but for enhanced international cooperation. I want to thank you all, and I want to also like to mention Marcelo Halaki, who is also one of the co-founders of the BRIC Lab, and I really thank him for bringing Christian and I together. Let's have a great working day. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marcos. To deliver the opening remarks on behalf of Columbia University, we're pleased to call to the podium Professor Merit Janow. She's a professor of practice in international economic law and international affairs, and also director of international finance and economic policy concentration. She was one of the 7 members of the WTO appellate body in 2003. She has extensive experience in academia, government, and business. Welcome.
Good morning. Welcome, Mr. Vice President, distinguished guests. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to introduce this BRIC Lab and give you just a word or two about Columbia University. As a professor at SIPA in the law school and director of the International Finance and Economic Policy program at Columbia, I'm very proud of this university. But let me mention a few dimensions of the university that are not obvious features of a great university, but I think are very defining for this initiative. First, we have a very strong tradition here at Columbia of interdisciplinary analysis, and nowhere is this more apparent than the collaboration that emanates from SIPA to other parts of this university, be it law, business, public health, economics, to name a few. Second, we have long had deep expertise in key regions of the world and set up established centers of study and affiliated faculty around East Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, Europe, and more. Third, we have well-established but still very much deepening academic faculty exchanges, joint degree programs with Sciences Po, London, Tokyo, Mexico, China, Brazil, Germany, and more, and we've created global centers around the world. Fourth, and perhaps more specific to today's discussion and recognition of the importance of the BRICs, a few years ago, 8 years ago, we re-examined our finance and economic policy program and recognized that a defining characteristic of it, and needed to be in the future, was much more emphasis on BRIC economies and emerging markets generally, and that would be a defining differentiator between our program and a standard business school program in finance. But the emphasis at SIPA and Columbia is broader still than economics, and it is indeed challenged to examine the big questions of the day, be they environment, security, economic growth, health, and to include as central elements of our work here a focus on emerging markets and BRIC economies as they engage with these big challenges. Now, I say this and believe this, but I thought before coming here I should actually look at our statistics and see if it's borne out by our courses and our students and our curriculum. And I just share with you a few statistics. For the 2010 to 2011 period, we have offered 10 courses at SIPA on BRIC countries alone. We have offered 118 courses on emerging markets and developing countries. We have held or planned some 98 events in 2010 and 11 that focus specifically on BRIC countries individually or collectively, and around 270 on emerging markets and developing countries. We have 2 full-time faculty from BRIC economies and 15 full-time from emerging markets. About 50% of our students are international. We have about 1,400 students in our program here at SIPA. 144 are from BRIC countries, and 230 are from other emerging markets. Thus, I think it's very fitting and natural for this innovative BRIC Lab initiative to be born at SIPA, and in addition for the courses and conferences that will be held in association with this initiative to be undertaken in each of the BRIC countries. I can assure you that while we do an awful lot here, it is our perception that these events around the world are important to bring thinking from outside the United States into Columbia as well. I want to thank particularly the creative and serious work of Christian Deseglise and Marcos Troyjo, and also the institutional support today from the Financial Times, Bloomberg, CNN, HSBC, the Forum das Americas, and for their support and their confidence in us. I think our discussion should begin. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, we will now hold our first session, which will be chaired by James Crombie. As a journalist, James has covered emerging market finance, economics, and politics in the past 17 years in London, Mexico City, and New York. He's currently an editor of Bloomberg Brief. James, the floor is yours.
Very much. A bit loud. Sorry. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to invite all of our panelists, please, to join us on the stage. And while they're doing that, say a few words. Just really to put this in perspective and add a little bit to what Christian, Marcos, and Merit have already said. 10 or 15 years ago, I think if you'd said that emerging markets would ever be the engine of economic growth, or even a safe haven for investors, or something you might base a whole course or a bank strategy on, you would have been declared, I think, mad in some cases, because other than natural resources and positive demographics, these countries seem to have very little going for them and tended to be a great source of instability. They were serial defaulters with no clear rules of the game for investors, plagued by corruption, countries that really needed to be told what to do and how to do it, typically with lots of money borrowed in cash from other places like the US and Europe, with a lot of strings attached. In 1998, we saw Russia default. In 2002, since this is a kind of a Brazil theme today, just wanted to remind everyone that the markets were implying a very, very high probability of a sovereign default when President Lula was elected, and the IMF had to come in with what at the time was a lot of money, $30 billion to rescue Brazil and stabilize Latin America. Fast forward to today, and the so-called developed economies are still in crisis. 3 years after taking a hit that called into question many assumptions about even big themes like Western capitalism and markets and the so-called risk-free rate, the Washington consensus, all of that seems to have been questioned very heavily. This week, IMF chief Christine Lagarde was in Latin America seeking support to help contain the European crisis. Last year, Brazil actually became a lender to the IMF through its purchase of $10 billion in SDR-denominated notes. China and Russia also joined in that funding strategy it was really a call from the G20 to help the IMF. It seems that Europe can learn a lot from not just Latin America, but all of the emerging markets. So how did we get here? What does this all mean for markets, and what does it all mean for global policy making? I'd like to start by asking Stephen King, the chief economist of HSBC, to give us a picture and tell us what he makes of it, and then we'll move to the other panelists and start the discussion. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and thank you for that introduction. I've got a quick 5 minutes to talk about the world, and in particular the BRICs. This is a discussion mostly about the emerging world. I come from a part of the submerging world. I come from the UK, where we have some perhaps slightly bigger difficulties than we've been used to in the past. And in many ways, we have difficulties in the UK, Europe, and much of the Western world, which in the past we used to only associate with the emerging world. So things have changed in an extraordinary fashion. I wanted to emphasize just a few things about how the world has changed so dramatically in such a short space of time. If you look at per capita incomes in China back in 1980, and look at how they compared in 1980 with the US, per capita incomes in China in 1980 were the equivalent of those in the US in 1790. Very, very low indeed. By 1990, per capita incomes in China had risen to the equivalent of those in the US in about 1860. And by 2000, they'd risen to per capita incomes in the US in about 1890. Last year, they were up to the levels in the US in about 1940. So in effect, China has delivered in each decade over the last 30 or 40 years the equivalent of 50 years of US progress over the last 150 years or so. It's an extraordinary phenomenon, particularly given the size of the country and the size of its population. The same is also true of India. Not quite as fast, but nevertheless still incredibly impressive. In India's case, it's achieving every 10 years what it took the US every 30 years to achieve. So these are phenomenal rates of expansion. It's always dangerous to extrapolate, but if you were to continue with these kinds of trends, for argument's sake, you'd find that by about 2040, 2050, the biggest economy in the world in GDP terms would be China. The US would be in second place. India will be in third place. The BRICs in general will be superpowers over the next few years. I'm not sure we fully understand or understood the implications of these extraordinary changes. But first of all, I just wanted to say a few words about why it is that these changes have come through. Why just over the last 20 or 30 years? The first reason, I think, is the extraordinary mobility of capital. You wanted to define the last 30 years of globalization. It is the ability of capital to move across borders. Western companies not so much investing in the States or in Europe, but increasingly investing in China or in Brazil or in India. A phenomenal change. Haven't seen it before. The second big change is technology, in particular the price of information technology collapsing, the ability to work out what's going on in other parts of the world much more easily than was the case in the past. Again, making it a lot easier to invest in parts of the world that wasn't possible previously. And the third big change I could capture in one simple word, which is openness, the willingness of countries to engage with each other. Take China as an example. Deng Xiaoping effectively opened China up to the rest of the world. It was an epic step, not just in terms of a change relative to the experience under Mao in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but rather it was an epic change in China's overall history over hundreds and hundreds of years. The Ming dynasty effectively shut China off from the rest of the world in the 1400s. It's only really opened up over the last 20 or 30 years. So I would argue that in many parts of the emerging world, you're seeing a process of economic catch-up, which is making up for hundreds of years of lost opportunities. This is not a story about the strength of the US consumer or the strength of the European consumer driving the growth of China, India, or Brazil. It's all about supply-side reforms, structural changes, which are creating extraordinary growth rates of the kind that we haven't seen in the past. And at the global level, these changes create really big challenges. Challenges in terms of models of capitalism. Do we have the free market capitalism of the West, or do we have, say, the state capitalism of somewhere like China? What's the difference between those models? How does the West cope with the increased demand for raw materials and commodities from countries in the emerging world? What happens to commodity prices? How do we cope with oil prices continuously rising, or metals prices, or food prices continuously rising? And if capital is mobile across borders, how do we cope with the changes in relative wages around the world? Think about the US at the moment, higher gasoline prices, downward pressure on wages. In part, that is a consequence of the increased gravitational pull of the emerging world. And also a big question about the emerging world itself. China and India in particular are still very heavily dependent on exports to the US, exports to Europe. How will that change? Now, my own view is that there's an opportunity over the next 20, 30 years to create what I call a Southern Silk Road, a series of new trade connections building on the original Silk Road in Asia hundreds of years ago. But this new Silk Road connecting Asia with the Middle East, Africa, with Latin America, leading to a massive increase in trade volumes and capital flows in those parts of the world which effectively bypass the US and Europe. So in my view, these are huge changes, huge opportunities in the emerging world, and in many ways huge challenges for the West. And I'll end my comments there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stephen. A lot to think about, lots to talk about. I'll move on to our next distinguished panelist, Anne Lee, professor of NYU, visiting professor at Peking University, to give us some thoughts on China, please.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here today. I'm very honored. And I want to start off by saying that I share all the enthusiasm that everyone has around the BRICs. As you all know, they've accomplished a great deal and have become a global influence around the world. We've gone from G7 to now G20. But I would like to play devil's advocate for just a brief moment and remind everyone that, while the BRICs have great potential to become the center of gravity, and they are growing very rapidly, that the center of gravity still remains here in the United States. After all, the United States still has the world's largest military, bar none. We have the world's reserve currency that remains unchallenged right now. We have media influence around the world that is unparalleled. And its higher institutions are still regarded as the best in the world. And so while the BRICs have come a long way, they still have much further to go in order to catch up with the United States. And the BRICs are not alone in rapid development. If we just look back in history, we can see that Europe and Japan also developed very rapidly after World War II and modernized very quickly to become very modern states. And of course, the Asian tigers also developed very rapidly, and I'm referring to Taiwan and Singapore. And so this is a path that has been traveled. And today we are obviously very excited about BRICs because these are countries of continental size embarking on this same path. And surely they show a lot of promise. However, I do think that in order for them to catch up and become the center of gravity in our generation, they would certainly need to innovate. We've heard that word many times, and certainly innovation in science and technology is very important. They need to be able to move away from relying on natural resources and of cheap labor in order to play catch-up. But I'm also talking about innovation in terms of a governance sense, in terms of helping people think of new ways to govern in a world that's increasingly becoming interdependent, interconnected, and it is possible within our lifetimes that nation states will no longer even be relevant in this world when national borders really cease to exist, with capital flows flowing as seamlessly as they do now, as well as trade. And so BRIC in the future may be a meaningless acronym. So what do I mean by innovation in a governance sense? Francis Fukuyama had written a book called End of History some time ago after the Soviet Union more or less ceased to become a superpower competitor to the United States. He declared that democratic capitalism was going to be the final, the best governance in the world. I would beg to disagree, because it would mean that there is no more human improvement if we believe that. And so I think that there is definitely still much more room for improvement in that regard. And I think that the BRICs right now are showing that they can add to this conversation. I've written a book called What the U.S. Can Learn from China to try to discuss this point, because China has learned a great deal from the West. And I believe that learning is a two-way street. I've spent some time in China when I was teaching at Peking University, and I discussed in my book some of the best practices that I saw that they were engaging in that I think that can be adopted in the West as well. And in this book, I discuss things, everything from culture to economic policy to foreign policy. And while I don't think that it is necessarily the handbook for how to do everything, and I don't advocate all things China, I do believe that there would be at some point somewhat of a convergence that will happen between the best of the West and the best of the East. And with that, I'd like to just conclude my remarks, and I really look forward to your questions later in the panel.
Thank you very much, Anne. A lot to think about there as well. I'm going to turn it over to Sergei Guriev, Rector at the New Economic School of Moscow, to talk a little bit about Russia, please.
Thank you very much, James. I will say a few words about where Russia fits in BRIC and how Russia is a bit different from BRIC, and also I will say a few words about the real challenges that BRIC is facing right now. Russia is the richest country in BRIC in terms of per capita GDP. It's probably going to join OECD soon. It's large, the largest landmass on this planet. It's growing. It actually may grow even faster if it undertakes necessary reforms, and yet it's separate from BRICs in very important ways. Unlike the other BRIC countries, Russia feels it's declining. It's growing, as I said, but it feels it's no longer a superpower like it used to be 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or 50 years ago. And in that sense, within Russia, there is a growing post-imperial syndrome. Russia is still thinking about itself as a kind of empire that is temporarily retreated. And we just heard from future President Mr. Putin, past President Mr. Putin, that he wants to recreate Eurasian Union. And this is not going to be Soviet Union, and I'm sure it's impossible to recreate Soviet Union. And yet it shows that there is a sentiment in Russia that Russia is suffering from post-imperial syndrome. And there are also objective factors that show that Russia is declining. Demographics are not positive. Russia is actually losing population. Corruption is high. Unlike other BRIC countries, not all of them are really democratic, but the progress is clearly in one direction. There is a direction of greater democracy, while Russia, at best, is going in circles. And in that sense, within Russia, there is a feeling that Russia is still has to do a lot of homework. And that's why if you look at surveys of Russians, including young Russians, you will see that Russians really don't care about the global issues. There is an inward-looking country which wants to do the homework and restore its economic strengths first, and also social strengths, to then become an important international power. And you can easily see that in this room there are many more Brazilian faces than Russian faces. That may be partly because of Marcos' convenient power, but also I think it is a genuine reflection of the fact that Russia is not really interested in the global issues because of this feeling of a loss of empire and the need of homework to be done to restore the power. But that also implies that Russia sees a benefit of BRIC per se, because BRIC, whether it brings tangible economic benefits to median Russian or not, BRIC definitely creates a system where US is no longer a unilateral source of force, and the West is not the only source of ideas and progress in this world. BRIC kind of creates a multipolar world, and for Russia per se, this is actually a value. And this is why Russia is very fond of being part of BRIC and very fond of BRIC being more important. And Russia has actually launched the BRIC summit. The first BRIC summit happened in Russia, and Russia will continue to promote the idea of BRIC and trying to make sure that BRIC or BRICs or BRIC with a K or BRIC with a T or S, A, M and other letters will be playing more and more important role. And let me, in the remaining couple of minutes, focus on the real issues that I think BRIC is facing now. And the real issues are related to the global governance and the role of BRIC that, in that global governance. I think we know that now the global institutions, international organizations have to give more power to countries like in BRIC, and it's going to be a very painful process. First, the West doesn't know how to transfer the power, how to extend the franchise. And second, well, BRIC countries are not sure whether they have everything they need actually to assume this power and to take over this responsibility. But this is unavoidable. As an economist, I can make a very simple case for that. BRIC countries, as we've just been talking for the last half an hour, are doing much better in terms of economic policy, fiscal policy in particular. Why? Exactly because BRIC countries have been through a number of crises in the recent decades, and they know that it's a huge humiliation if you run out of cash. And they also know that they're too big now, too big to save. They're not only too big to fail, and they've been allowed to fail a couple of times in the recent decades, but they're also too big to save. IMF doesn't have enough cash to save Russia or China or Brazil now. And in that sense, the only source of national sovereignty for these countries is actually to be responsible, responsible in financial and macroeconomic terms. And hence, these countries are becoming international net creditors rather than debtors. And like in every corporate finance course taught in SIPA or in economics department on the business school on this campus, the power should sit with the creditor. If you give money to somebody, you have to know that if this debtor doesn't pay you back, you have a right to take over control over the assets, over the decision making. And this is exactly why IMF quotas should not be just redistributed proportional to the weight of the economy, but actually BRIC should have more power than just weight of the economy. Exactly like in the Bretton Woods agreements many years ago, the West had much more power than the share of its economy in the global economy. Why? Because at that point the West was the creditor and the emerging markets were the debtors. And now it's going to be vice versa. And whatever we do, whatever we think about that, this is unavoidable because the West is not going to change overnight and become a responsible macroeconomic player, while the BRIC has already done that, and the BRIC, along with other emerging markets, is a net creditor and will have to take power. And I think this is exactly when the main challenge is, and this is where BRIC leaders have to coordinate how they will actually contribute to global governance, how they can actually take over responsibilities over the planet, partially taking some power from the West. And as I said, unfortunately, Russia is interested in that, but basically the Russian public is much more inward focused than it should have been, given the size and role of Russia in the global economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sergei. I'm delighted to have with us today the Vice President of Brazil, Mr. Michel Temer. He's going to be speaking in Portuguese, so everyone has a headset for translation. And I would invite the Vice President, please, to give us his thoughts on Brazil. Thank you.
I would like initially to salute all of you, but to take the freedom to salute the governor of the state of Rio de Janeiro, the governor Sergei Cabral, that will participate in the next panel. I would like to salute you all, and I would like to start by complimenting the initiative of this BRIC Lab that will debate the question of BRICs, and to salute as well the Columbia University for the opportunity extended to host this event, because all the works, like the words that everybody before me mentioned, we need this lab like this one installed here today to discuss exactly what's the direction the BRIC is following, what do they want, and what does it mean. And when we raise these preoccupations, these concerns, me, in my point of view, I think the following. The first concept of this union, of this cooperation between these four countries, including now South Africa, in the last meeting that happened. The goal is to exchange ideas and to have cooperation between these countries, because the big question, and this is just to provoke thought in this lab that we are now installing, it's to verify if it is possible indeed the legal nature of BRIC, because in truth, facing vis-à-vis the globalization, we can see that the countries, and this is a new reality after the Second World War, countries are getting together to find common goals. But when they get together, they create international treaties like European Union. That today eliminates its borders and its university borders and the access to the country and out of the country, even in a political and institutional focus. This changes reasonably the sovereignty criteria of these countries. What do I mean by this is that the sovereignty, like I meant today, and the Law University here in Columbia University about the evolution of the state. I mentioned that to say that sovereignty is what defines states. But I say that it's important to say that globalization is anchored in the idea of information, that it's now spread throughout the world. When we came out of the World War II, we didn't have the capacity of the possibility of information that we now have today in the world. It's enough to say that the natural information through the media, but the information through the social networks. How many movements have been created in these last 4, 5, 6 years in these social networks that communicate through the internet? So this phenomenon of communication is very strongly linked to the globalization phenomena. I say again that the states are not preserving anymore their sovereignty because they have globalized interests. But here I say again, I pose again the question, about this lab, with this lab that examines the question of BRIC. Are we going to head towards consolidation of a legal juridical and institutional between BRICs, as it's done in the case of Europe, like it's done in Mercosur, this Latin America Union, because we started with 4 countries to break borders of several types of customs, universities, and even of free circulation between these countries. So there, in the case of Mercosur, in the case of Europe, we have a phenomenon that it's consolidated at a level of political and legal point of view. When we have another crisis, it is a consequence of the lack of adjustment of growth between these countries, because the growth of each one of these countries is asymmetrical. And because it is so, when a pact, a treaty, international treaty is established like Mercosur or in Europe, this asymmetry, the country experiences slower development or political challenges, and what happens is that a difficulty
ensues in this alliance that was established. And the BRIC cases, I am not going to dare to speak about alliances or except to say that it's an instrument for the cooperation and exchange of ideas and experiences between the actors of the BRIC concept. We have seen the first meeting in Russia, in Ekaterinburg. The second one was in Brasilia, and the third in Sanya, and the next one will be in India. What we have seen throughout this period, from 2009 until now, was an enormous exchange of cooperation and information in special areas like health, education, energy, transportation. This is very important for any one of these countries, in specific Brazil. And so, therefore, to identify exactly what is the nature of this association, it's something that will be of the responsibility of these studies that you, gentlemen, are going to promote here in this Columbia University. It is important to define this because the expression, and this is my personal opinion, what I feel is that vis-à-vis the differences, cultural differences, and sometimes political difference between these several countries, it's difficult to arrive at an alliance that's not possible to be eliminated. So we needed to have an instrument of cooperation. This globalization phenomenon leads to ideas of countries that want to associate to the first one, like many people said before, but me, that other countries are wanting to get into this. Even the jokes of the labeling of BRIC to include several other letters, several other countries to modify its labeling. So this phenomenon is the interaction of the joint action that the sovereign states want amongst them. But it's important to note as well that when we see an international treaty that works as an integrative factor between the states, it is guided by contiguity, like in South America, for example, when we speak about the Mercosur, or the UNASUR that gathers the countries of Latin America. This is done for an economical and cultural cooperation, but based on the idea of the contiguity, like in the case of Europe, and recently, like last week in Lebanon, I heard, like from the president of Lebanon, a question that was very curious, that was fruit of this globalization idea. What he told me was that he would like to integrate the Mercosur. Lebanon is one side of the world, and Mercosur is down there on the other side. But if we translate his expression, what he meant was that he wanted to be integrated culturally, economically, politically with the countries of Mercosur, which is a circumstance with Mr. Sergio Cabral I brought to Brazil with the intention of trying to have companies from Brazil operate in Lebanon, and the Lebanon companies can operate in Brazil, and we can exchange experiences. This is the reality of our days. So I do believe that define what BRIC is fundamental, even though this definition may come from the affirmation that it is not, like it is not at the time, of an organ organized internationally. It is only efforts that were gathered, and I'm making a parenthesis here. The first perception of this concept, BRIC, was economical and financial perception. It was fruit of an economic and financial analysis that these countries grew so much that they will influence and will have an impact of world governance. So they have to be considered by the countries that after Second World War assumed the world leadership. So we need to take into account these countries. And if I can say, in the case of Brazil, we have, in a very short period of time, an extraordinary growth in our country. The first moment after the Constitution of 1988, when a new Brazilian state was created, was exactly to obtain the stability of currency. And we achieved that. Today, Brazil, it's a country with almost zero inflation. So we have an enormous stability. And after, and as well, as we'll see, with a certain freedom, democratic freedom, fantastic democratic freedom, because in this country, in our country, we preserve and we stress principles that are very dear to the United States of America also, which is the freedom of speech, manifestation. But of course, we think if we try to apply this principle, it would not be enough to have the freedoms that I just cited. We need to go forward. We need to move ahead of a social kind democracy, what we call the democracy of bread on the table. We achieved this in Brazil throughout these 8-9 years. We were able to move away from extreme poverty and bring them to middle class. And this ascension to middle class allowed for an increase in consume. And curiously as well, made us able to face and overcome the 2009 crisis. Because when this happened in Europe and in other countries, United States, in Brazil, the President Lula at the time said, we are going to continue to consume, because if we do not consume, we will not have production, and if we not have production, we don't have employment, and if we don't have employment, we don't have development. Very well. So these people, the middle class in our country, will continue to consume greatly. There was a government politic of reducing the taxes. We reduced the taxes over appliances, cars, construction materials, and this increased production in our country. We did that, what normally corporations do. How are we going to take advantage of a crisis? This is what our perspective was. When we have a crisis, we have to know how to take advantage of the crisis. And I believe that our country, we have the ambassador, we have Mário Carneiro here present, people important of weight in our country. I knew that for the international arena, vis-à-vis the crisis, and as said here before, for a long time, IMF ruled and said, and legitimately so, the destiny for our country. It said we cannot raise anything for the public workers or for the well-being, welfare. We need a big reform. And throughout these 8-10 years, we pay the IMF. Today we have reserves that are big, more than $350 billion, and about more than that, we now lend money to the IMF to help with the world government. So it's this particular fact that we expect that the BRICs countries that emerge, because we speak very much these days of emerging countries, they emerge, and we hope that they can collaborate for this world governance, not just by their development, because this increases the GDP at the world level, but to help countries that are going through difficulties.
I would like to say that in Brazil we are now stable, not so much, not only from a public freedoms, but also economically. Just yesterday, our finance minister, next to President Dilma, was announcing measures of a tax reduction. And since you started to see another international crisis, Brazil says again, let's consume, let's produce. We will not allow backwards movement in the Brazilian development. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to be here in this meeting, being invited to it. So it's an honor for me, a little bit in an academic function, but very much in a function of a member of government, Vice President of the Republic of Brazil, to review Brazil's interest in global governance and to review, of course, its integration in the phenomenon so-called BRIC. I say phenomenon because we still don't have a legal term, a legal label for this for this movement. So I sincerely hope that along these this discussion, this very opportune discussion here at the Columbia University, we can get to a conclusion, at least that will take us to a suggestion about the nature, I'd say, political, institutional of the BRICs in the modern world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I think you raised some very important points, and I would like to see if we can get to at least some hint of an answer in the short space that we have. So I'd like to start by asking all of our panelists, in response to your point, Mr. Vice President, what is BRIC? What does it look like? Is it Mercosur? Is it EU? Is it just a convenient acronym and a chatting forum? Or is there going to be something, that joins these countries together and makes them work together? And if I can start with Stephen, who's also written a book and has the answers to this question, I hope.
Yes, I have written a book. It's called Losing Control. You can find it on Amazon. I should warn you, though, that on Amazon there's another thing called Losing Control, which is a pornographic DVD, so please make sure that you buy the right thing rather than the wrong thing. I think it's important to recognize that there are lots of different kinds of sovereign arrangements and lots of kinds of mutually economic and financial arrangements may come through in the years ahead. And I wanted to cite one example already, which is not directly associated with the BRICs in general, but which is associated with the relationship between Russia and China. And it's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which you could arguably say is almost like a cartel between energy producers and energy consumers across Central Asia, Russia, and China. And what it reveals is that you're beginning to see the creation of new cross-border political entities, which in effect exclude both the states and exclude Europe. And that, I think, is very, very important, because if it is the case that we're going to see these extraordinary increases in the size of economies in the years ahead, those economies do have to work much more closely with each other. I'd also add, and this goes back to my earlier comment about the idea of a Southern Silk Road, this South-South series of trade connections. There is a kind of fundamental question about how these different countries can grow, how they can expand, if the US, if Europe are burdened with debt and really themselves can't expand. And what I think is an opportunity for the BRICs across these different areas is to see an extraordinary increase in the pace of export and capital flow growth in the years ahead. If you look at the OECD nations and look at their growth rates in the 50s and 60s, think about the phenomenal rates of growth in Japan, Europe, often 5 to 10% per year. That was hugely helped by growth of bilateral trade. Bilateral trade growth was often up at between 15 and 20% per year. So if you wanted to explain why it was that these economies grew so quickly, it was their ability to integrate with each other that proved to be so incredibly powerful. Looking around the world today, the volumes of trade that exist within the OECD are very, very high. The volumes of trade between individual OECD countries and individual emerging nations are now very, very high. But the volumes of trade across the emerging world, I would argue, are still very, very low. They're still thin. If that opportunity can be exploited, if the economic borders can be reduced, the opportunity is there for the BRIC nations and the small nations associated with them to have what might be a tenfold increase in the volume of trade over the next 30 or 40 years. So the importance of these political arrangements, I think, is incredibly high. The importance of relating to each other is incredibly high because the opportunities for doing so are there to be grasped.
Thank you. Anne, what do you make of the BRIC? How does China work with the rest of it? It takes you a long time to get from Latin America to China. How do you work together?
Yeah, I think that the BRICs will work together where their interests are aligned. And one of those areas that seem quite obvious is the idea of currency. China has been creating bilateral arrangements to have trade settled in RMB with Russia and then increasingly with Latin America and other Asian nations. And so I think that that could be a basis of where they can have more cooperation. And I agree with Stephen's comments about increasing trade. So I think it will always start with where the lowest hanging fruit are.
Do you think China would be open to signing some kind of formal pact with the other BRIC countries that formalizes this relationship?
Well, right now I think China works most comfortably working on nations on an individual basis, and whether they're going to do one on a group level remains to be seen. But I'm sure that they're open to that kind of dialogue.
One thing I'd just like to add on this is that the relationship between China and India is crucial in the years ahead. The relationship is not exactly strong at this stage for all sorts of historical reasons, but if you're looking at the opportunities for trade within Asia, if you can get some kind of political thawing between those two countries, the opportunities, I think, are absolutely enormous.
Sergei, you mentioned that Russia's very inward-looking right now. I mean, why should it bother about the other BRICs, and what kind of a relationship do you think it wants with the other BRICs?
I agree with what Stephen said and what Anne said especially. I think on each particular issue, the BRIC countries will discuss what can be done together. And I think it will remain an informal club where countries just meet and discuss how then they take their points of view to the global institutions, international organizations, informal global platforms like G20. And in some cases, they indeed being at a similar level of development and similar standing as, say, net creditors or indeed potential issuers of new reserve currencies. I think these countries will have common interests and they will act in common interests. And one shouldn't really assume that it's always going to be the case, and I would like to refer to one important example. Recently, remember, a new IMF managing director was supposed to be nominated, and BRIC countries actually represent an important voice within the IMF now already, but they've not coordinated. And we saw that Russia, for example, went with the G8, the G7, and supported the French candidate. So in that sense, I think it's completely normal that these countries occasionally will act in a discoordinated way, while in some cases, in some issues, they will of course act together. But there will be I think there will be no legally binding treaty between these countries. These countries are so different in many respects, political, demographic. Also, their interests in trade are very different. The distances are also very, very large. And I agree here that for some product categories, these countries are probably competitors rather than cooperators. And in that sense, I think there will be no simple answer to your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, if I may ask a question in English. If trade is the stepping stone, what is Brazil doing to increase trade with the other BRIC countries?
Olha, eu acabo concordando com o que todos acabaram de dizer aqui, né? E isto parte da premissa de que as decisões do BRIC, se decisões se verificarem, não são obrigatórias. São diferentes, como disse, daquelas decisões emanadas de órgãos que acabam fazendo um pacto, um tratado internacional. Então, na verdade, nós temos fórmulas de cooperação. Eu próprio, como vice-presidente, institucionalmente, presido duas comissões de alto nível, uma comissão de alto nível Brasil-Rússia e uma comissão de alto nível Brasil-China. E muito recentemente eu estive nesta qualidade com o primeiro-ministro Putin na Rússia, tratando exatamente da formulação de uma declaração conjunta. Ora bem, Brasil e Rússia fazem parte do BRIC, mas desta atividade, como acabou de dizer o meu antecessor, não participaram os demais países do BRIC, participaram Brasil e Rússia individualmente. Mas agora, no ano que vem, teremos também uma reunião com a China, mas será uma reunião Brasil-China. Portanto, não há ainda, por força do BRIC, como órgão formulador de políticas, ele formula para sugerir, ele não formula para obrigar. Quando nestas reuniões que se verificaram em Brasília, em Sânia, em Ekaterimburgo, a troca de informações, a troca de ideias, a troca de mensagens, no plano, eu digo, no plano da saúde, no plano da educação, no plano da energia, foram sugestões feitas de um para outro país. Mas, mais uma vez, nós esbarramos agora na questão da inexistência de um órgão coordenador desse trabalho que, digamos assim, recebendo as sugestões de cada país, os faça impositivos para os países contratantes.
Thank you. We obviously live in a completely different world now than several years ago. The hope that was expressed, the potential that it was expressed at the beginning of this event for growth, for transformation of these economies, how much is that jeopardized by what's going on in the rest of the world? Surely there's going to be some impact on commodities. Surely there's going to be some impact on consumption or imports from BRIC countries. It's impossible to believe that these emerging economies are not in the firing line of this crisis that we're going through in Europe. Maybe I could start by directing that at Stephen. You're an expert on Europe.
Well, the Eurozone crisis at the moment gets worse and worse rather than better and better. There's now a significant risk of possibly a deep recession in Europe over the course of the next 12 months. We know from the experience of the subprime crisis in 2008, 2009 that the vast majority of emerging nations proved to be extremely vulnerable. There were, however, two key exceptions. China, which proved to be stronger than almost anyone believed at the time, and the second was India. But it is the case currently, as with the subprime crisis, that there is a desperate pressure within financial systems to head for liquid assets. And in global capital markets, emerging market assets are simply not liquid. So the desire to hold dollars, treasuries, and so on and so forth is also a desire which is damaging from the point of view of emerging market assets. That's a short-term issue. The thing we learned over the course of the last few years was that the emerging nations were also able to bounce back. This was something that came as a surprise. The US and Europe continued to deleverage. They didn't have any ability to bounce back, despite the fact that you had massive policy stimulus. They're still incredibly sluggish. But think about China as an extreme example. China's level of income is 40 or 50% higher now than it was 5 or 6 years ago. That's despite the stagnation of the US, despite the stagnation of Europe. So you can talk about decoupling in different ways. In the very short term, day-to-day, capital markets, no decoupling at all. On a cyclical basis, quarter to quarter, year to year, probably not much decoupling. But on a structural basis, 3, 4, 5 years in a row, lots of evidence of decoupling. The structural story of emerging markets is extraordinarily powerful. So bumpy ride ahead, but longer term, I think the story remains intact.
Even if the euro falls apart?
If the euro falls apart, then we can all just sort of give up and go home, I think, because that's where you start talking about a Great Depression or something like that. So let's just try to park that on one side and hope it doesn't happen.
Okay. Anne?
Yeah, I mean, I believe that I'll speak for China as opposed to the other countries, but yes, I believe China is concerned about the growth in other developed countries, and so they have stated, obviously, in their 5-year plan that they would like to rebalance their economy away from being dependent on exports to the developed world and increase their internal consumption. And that would be good news for the rest of the world if China can successfully engineer this transition. They are very dedicated to creating more services in their economy. They have targets for creating more jobs in social welfare, in healthcare, in education. And so they are very cognizant of the risks in the global economy and are trying to figure out ways to insulate themselves this way. But this is going to take a lot of time and many years. And so if the euro crisis happens much sooner, there's no doubt that China will be severely impacted. And I doubt that they have much way of hedging those kind of risks other than to try to diversify their current economy. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. How can Brazil withstand this crisis?
Olha, você sabe que é evidente que sempre ela terá repercussões no Brasil. Por exemplo, em 2008, 2009, nós estávamos com um avanço no PIB significativo, tivemos uma redução nesse avanço. Evidentemente, se ocorrer este desastre referentemente ao euro, não é? Isto terá repercussão no nosso país. Mas a tese lá, que eu acabei de expor na minha fala, é de que nós deveremos cuidar de aumentar sempre a produção. E mais ainda, eu mencionei que nós tiramos desses últimos 8 anos cerca de 30 milhões de pessoas que não eram capazes de consumir, portanto não geravam produção, e levamos para a classe média para produzir. E agora ainda, eu devo reconhecer, nós temos ainda 16 milhões de pessoas que vivem numa faixa de extrema pobreza. Quando eu digo extrema pobreza, são pessoas que vivem com valores abaixo de 50, 40, 50 dólares por mês. Então nós estamos com planos agora para também levar essas 16 milhões de pessoas para a classe média, ou seja, serão 16 milhões, é quase um país, 16 milhões de novos consumidores, que ensejarão o aumento da produção. Portanto, o Brasil, neste ponto, está muito focado, muito voltado para a sua economia interna, né? E para preservar-se de eventuais crises internacionais.
So what's the idea, what's the plan for interest rates and what is the tolerance for inflation? Do you think that Brazil will be more lax with policy to allow that?
Nós partimos agora para a redução dos juros. Sabe que a taxa de juros no Brasil, eu reconheço, era muito elevada. Mas nesses últimos tempos nós, paulatinamente, estamos diminuindo 0,5% praticamente ao mês, ou a cada 2 meses, na taxa de juros, o que naturalmente incrementa a produção. E a inflação no Brasil não é uma coisa preocupante. Mesmo neste ano, quando se esboçava uma inflação de cerca de 7 ou 8% ao ano, ela não chegará a este índice. O índice será bem menor. Portanto, é uma, digamos assim, uma certa confiança do investidor brasileiro e do investidor estrangeiro na economia nacional. Então, o nosso caminho é esse. Vamos reduzir os juros e, evidentemente, teremos uma política de redução dos gastos públicos para impedir a inflação.
Thank you. Stephen, you had a comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to make one quick comment, which is that one of the big challenges for all of the BRICs, for emerging markets in general, is that the US is committed now to extremely low interest rates for a very long period of time. And before this latest crisis, one of the big concerns within emerging markets was the possibility that with these low US interest rates, we'd end up with too much inflation. I think one of the things that might hold China back this time around, relative to 2 years ago, is the fear that if you offer too much stimulus, you again have a battle against inflation. And one big question here for all emerging markets is, to what extent do they detach themselves from their linkages to US monetary policy? Because if they don't do that and the US is setting policy for a country that's deleveraging, does it create inflationary problems, asset price problems over the next few years?
Thank you. Sergei, do you see a problem there in Russia?
Well, compared to 2008, when Russia was hit by lower oil price and sudden stop in financial markets and governments' inability to respond quickly. I think now Russia is much better prepared with governments developed a lot of better instruments to respond to a crisis. Financial system is actually healthier. Central bank is prepared to let ruble float rather than to support it like it was in 2008, in a very counterproductive way, raising interest rates, ruble interest rates during the recession. So I think this time around Russia is kind of better prepared. Even though if oil price goes down and stays low, say at 50, for say a couple of years, I think Russia will have to well, I think there is a high probability that Russia will have a different government, which probably is not a disaster. I think we should talk about other issues which have much more important medium-term and longer implications for Russia. In the medium term, I think if Europe doesn't get out of this crisis in a reasonably healthy manner, I think within Russia there will be a growing understanding within the elite that democracy doesn't work and Western democracy doesn't work, which will actually slow down democratic transition in Russia. And the other more important long-term implication is if Europe doesn't really work out, if European project stumbles or indeed goes back or indeed Euro collapses, I think there'll be a growing understanding that global governance is hard, and it's very hard to achieve something supranational, because Europe is the deepest supranational integration project. So far it's been very successful. We actually got used, we are taking for granted that European integration works. Now in the recent decade, we see that it's not really working out that well. And if European project collapses or retreats, I think there'll be a lot of skepticism and pessimism with regard to supranational institutions. And this is where I think countries like BRIC will be much less willing to lead or participate in the leadership of the global governance institutions. And this, I think, is the most dangerous fallout of the European crisis if that happens. I think the shorter-term issues are indeed temporary and not that important. Thank you.
Thank you. I do want to leave time for questions. I've got hundreds of questions myself, but I'm sure you do too. So if anyone from the floor would like to ask a question of our distinguished panel, please raise your hand, and I think there are a couple of microphones. If not, I'll just keep asking them. Yes, sir. Yeah. Do you want to take the microphone and tell us who you are? I think it's on the... yeah.
Hi, my name is Dominic Combs. I'm a second-year graduate student at Columbia SIPA and specializing in economic and political development. So thank you for being here. Christian was actually my professor in emerging markets, so it's very fitting. My question was for Mr. Sergei. You said that you think if Europe fails to come out of the sovereign debt crisis, that the elites in Russia would think that the democratic system of government is a failure. And I was wondering if you think the current system of government there, however you would define it, is sustainable. And if you think, in fact, if Europe does fail to come out of the crisis correctly, will Russia completely do a 180 back to, I guess, more of a Soviet style of government?
Thank you. Sergei, you are planning to go back to Moscow, aren't you?
I think Russia is a free country, and many things that I'm going to say now, you can actually see those in speeches of president and prime minister, future president, future prime minister. They always acknowledge that Russia is an imperfect democracy at best, and they use words like stagnation, and they understand that a responsible fiscal policy is actually responsible and leading to a dead end. They also refer to Soviet Union experience, which pursued policies a bit like Russia's pursuing now, and this country, which used to be kind of forever, is no more. And I think the current system is not democratic. I think we see a lot of evidence that government is not accountable, that elections are not free. And again, this is something that you can read in speeches of Putin and Medvedev. To what extent this policy is sustainable? I think this policy is sustainable as long as oil price is growing. I think this is there is a mistake to think about Russia as a presidential democracy. So take United States. United States will not cut budget deficit seriously before the presidential election. Once the new president is elected, whether it's Democrat or Republican, he or she will have 2 years, at least before midterm elections, to do something unpopular. And from what we know about presidential democracies around the world, this is exactly when fiscal consolidations happen, right after presidential elections. In Russia, it's not exactly the same. On paper, it's a presidential democracy, but government's very much afraid of street protesters. So if you cut budget deficit, if you cut expenditure, even the next day after the election, they can still take it to the street and government can still be toppled. And that's why government expenditure is growing year after year. Go back 5 years from now, you'll see that Russia would need oil price at something like $50 or $55 per barrel to balance the budget. Now this number is more like $115 per barrel. So this regime needs higher and higher oil price to balance its books and keep Russians happy. And if something happens to the oil price, Russia will first use reserves, Russia will borrow, Russia will privatize probably, but eventually the government will have to become more accountable. And in that sense, this regime will somehow transform, either from within or from the outside. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Yes, over here, please.
Thank you. I'm Ava Chian. I'm a Columbia University alumni. My question actually has to do with financial participation. It seems as if with the developed countries' depression, they have invited the participation, I mean, in my understanding from China, to help prop up the financial depression. Do you see that adding to the responsibilities of general BRIC countries? Thank you.
Sergei?
Yeah, I think it's a very important development. And as I said, Western countries are not always happy seeing sovereign funds, state companies from China or, say, Russia investing in their assets. But that is changing. 5 years ago, it would be unthinkable that Chinese sovereign funds would invest, or Middle Eastern sovereign funds would buy stakes in the leading American investment banks. And then we saw that happening in 2007. Now, it's actually much harder to convince Chinese investors now to invest in investment banks or banks in the Western countries after that experience. And the Chinese investors and Russian investors will actually ask for better prices, for better stock prices. But even now, with the European crisis, when European banks are facing major difficulties, I think there is still no appetite within Europe to sell stakes to Chinese investors or to Russian investors directly. Every sale like this is actually going to be very painful. But that may change, because if you run out of cash, you need to sell something you can sell. And in that sense, I think we will see more and more investment from BRIC countries into, especially in financial sector, in the developed countries. And I think it's great because it raises interdependence and responsibility on both sides. And it also gives a voice to investors from China and Russia and Brazil and India and the Middle East in the way the Western economies are run. Thank you.
Doesn't give them an over-reliance on treasuries and the dollar. That's worrying. Maybe
I'd actually just like to add that, I mean, I think that for China, it was a wonderful development to be asked to participate on the world stage and offer more global responsibility, because, quite frankly, they see it as a way of, finally having saving face of being recognized for their achievements. And it's not clear to me that they necessarily would want to have stakes in assets per se, but more about, having certain rights and recognition, maybe more influence in the IMF. So they could potentially negotiate along those lines. But in terms of how they view the euro crisis, I mean, I think that they think it's one, fiscal irresponsibility, and two, it's a problem created by the investment bankers. And so they still see this as somewhat of a political problem, and therefore have probably been a little bit more reluctant to jump right in.
Thank you. Stephen.
Debtors always have an incentive to try to shift the burden back to creditors. So if the creditors are buying pieces of paper that may be devalued at some point in the future, then the creditors are going to feel understandably very nervous. I think it was odd that when Klaus Regling, the head of the EFSF, went over to Beijing the other week, he was basically asking the Chinese to bail out Europe when China has a per capita income of $7,500 a year in purchasing power parity terms. Greece is up at $28,000 a year, France is at $34,000 a year, and Germany's at $36,000 a year. If I was a creditor nation, I would insist on trying to buy assets that are not likely to fall in value, so not pieces of paper, but real assets, companies, that sort of thing, over the course of the next few years. And the problem here is very simple. That Britain, for example, we're happy to sell our companies to all sorts of foreign bidders. For example, the entirety of Britain's electricity is supplied by the French, by EDF, which is a nationalized French company. We have no problem with that because we have an entente cordiale. The French and the English just about get on with each other, just about. But the problem at the global level is that there's an incredible level of mistrust between the different political systems of these different countries. So the problem is blurring the distinction between a commercial decision and a state decision. And that's why I think the West feels uncomfortable with, which is why this balance between creditors and debtors is so difficult to resolve.
Do we have time for one last question? I think there's one, very briefly, please.
I'm from Shanghai International Studies University, and now as the Fulbright visiting scholar at SIPA, I feel privileged to attend this conference. And I still feel privileged that Portuguese is learned and taught in our university, and the students are in high demand because nowadays more and more corporations and institutions have strong interest in Brazil. And my question goes to the President. Say, how do you evaluate China and Brazil relations in the future, cooperative or competitive? And another question is the 2012 World Football Games and the 26 Olympic Games is coming. And do you have any national language strategies and let the world know more about Brazil? Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, to close, please.
Well, in the first place, I would like to say, answering that question, that the vision of Brazil regarding China is a vision of cooperation. Recently, we had a lunch, a group of Brazilian entrepreneurs between Brazil and China, and I saw something interesting there. Some Brazilian businessmen look at China as a competing market exactly because China exports in the area of fabric and toys, a lot of goods to Brazil. Another share of these businessmen look at China as a consumer market, so much so that there are companies in the area of food that establish themselves in China with a lot of success and bring currency to Brazil. So there's a conflict of perceptions here. On the one hand, Brazilians looking at China as a competing market, and on the other hand, seeing China as a consumer market and not a producing market. But the general thesis is that Brazil, in its relationship with China, that's why I mentioned this so-called high-level commission, Brazil-China, which I chair, to do the iteration and integration of the work in Brazil between Brazil and China. And finally, regarding the World Cup, I would like to relate that Brazil is preparing not only for the World Cup, but as well as to the Olympics in the city of Rio de Janeiro, preparing its infrastructure so that in the Olympics, in that case, for instance, have the same world effect that China had when they had a marvelous Olympics that divulged China in when Brazil looks at China at that level, World Cup, Olympics, Brazil wants to follow the Chinese example because it's a way to obtain more international renown through sport.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but please take advantage of the coffee breaks and the rest of the day to interrogate our distinguished panelists and join me in thanking all of them.